protect the economy. But Northern Ireland's Democratic Unionist Party, on whose votes the government relies in the House of Commons, says it will vote against. Our Ireland correspondent Emma Vardy reports from Belfast, where the DUP conference is taking place, and her report does contain some flashing images.
It's the most closely watched conference in the party's history. Northern Ireland's DUP, whose support the government depends on in Parliament, are poised to vote down the draft Brexit deal.
The published withdrawal agreement portrays a pitiful and pathetic place for the United Kingdom. Hundreds of pages devoted to a backstop which would bind the United Kingdom into taking the rules of the European Union with no right to leave and no end date.
Their objections remain with the so-called backstop, the plan to avoid a hard Irish border. And today the DUP's deputy leader had this message.
So, Prime Minister, the message from this conference, from every section of this party, is bin the backstop.
Top Tories have been in town trying to allay DUP fears. Last night, the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, told delegates at a private dinner that the backstop may never have to be used. But if it is, say the DUP, Northern Ireland would remain fixed to EU rules, even after the rest of the UK goes its own way. Many Northern Ireland businesses are backing the deal, putting business at odds with the DUP, who say it undermines the integrity of the UK.
Well, I think that's an argument that no one in the business community in Northern Ireland accepts. It's very seldom in Northern Ireland you see unanimity about anything, but when you find that every single business organisation is telling you something different, then I think the DUP should take cognizance of that.
The DUP will continue defending their position here, remaining dug in against that draft deal, and they're about to be cheered on by another big Brexiteer when Boris Johnson takes to the stage here this afternoon. Emma Vardy, BBC News, Belfast.
Theresa May is expected to be in Brussels later this afternoon ahead of tomorrow's meeting of EU heads of government. Spain's Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez, though, insists he will not attend unless Spanish objections concerning Gibraltar are sorted out. Our correspondent Gavin Lee is in Brussels. Gavin, how serious is the Spanish threat of a no-show?
Well, Pedro Sanchez, the Prime Minister, has arrived back in Madrid from Cuba, where he gave that speech last night to say that the Spanish, unless they have an explicit legal text saying that Spain has a say, a final say with the UK over Gibraltar, which it still contests, the British overseas territory, then he will not be attending tomorrow's summit, which effectively, according to EU officials, mean the summit cannot go ahead because you cannot have an extraordinary summit with one key member missing. Now, with talking to EU officials today, they are saying that the Brits and the Spanish officials are trying to come to some way to placate the Spanish, and they're going that way. And as things stand, it appears that the summit is still scheduled. So after 17 months of negotiations, this time tomorrow, both the withdrawal agreement, the legal document, effectively the withdrawal treaty, and the political declaration for the future are due to be signed off. And the tone, we're told, from both sides will be sombre to reflect what's been 45 years of British membership in the EU.
Gavin Lee in Brussels, thank you. In Paris, police have used tear gas and water cannon to disperse protesters demonstrating for a second weekend against a planned rise in fuel tax. Clashes broke out on the Champs-Élysées despite a police security cordon around key sites. Over the past year, the price of diesel has risen by around 23%. Lisa Hampley reports.
A sea of yellow, the protesters in their trademark high-vis jackets on the Champs-Élysées. The authorities mean business too, using water cannon and tear gas against the thousands of protesters, trying to prevent them moving down to the Palais de la Concorde and the presidential palace, which has been cordoned off. Organisers bill this as Act 2 in their rolling campaign. They're angry about an increase in diesel tax, justified by the government as an anti-pollution levy. But the campaign has grown into a broad opposition against President Emmanuel Macron. This metalworker says, "We feel like we've been working for years now, and it's just extortion, while members of the government live like princes. It's not even possible to live anymore after paying taxes," says this woman. "I'm disgusted. I'm telling you, if I saw him, I wouldn't be able to shake his hand, and I'd tell him exactly what I think." Some here have been ripping up the street and trying to build barricades. But as protesters let off fireworks, the authorities have the power to move them on. Close to 300,000 people protested across France last week. It's estimated that by the end of today, 30,000 will have taken to the streets here in Paris. Lisa Hamperley, BBC News.
Police are questioning a man after an officer was stabbed outside a train station in East London. Police said the male officer was attacked with a knife outside Ilford Station last night. His injuries are not thought to be life-threatening. Climate change will cost the United States hundreds of billions of dollars and damage human health if no action is taken, a US government report has warned. President Donald Trump has repeatedly cast doubt on the reality of climate change. Our correspondent James Cook has more.
This, say many scientists, is what climate change looks like. In recent years, California has seen bigger, deadlier and more destructive wildfires than ever before. During a cold snap in Washington this week, President Trump tweeted, "Whatever happened to global warming?" Now his own government experts have answered the question. It's here, they say. Its effects are serious, and without dramatic change, they will be catastrophic. Already, says the report, more frequent and intense storms like Hurricane Harvey, which ravaged Houston in Texas, are destroying property and may damage critical infrastructure such as bridges, power plants and oil refineries. Crop yields and labour productivity will decline. There will be a rise in the spread of tropical disease. The poorest Americans will be hardest hit.
One of the things that's quite striking about the report, for example, is that we could see a future where the southeastern parts of the United States experience forest fire seasons that look like what happens in the West right now.
The scientists say substantial and sustained reductions in global greenhouse gas emissions are essential, and they do report some progress. Without major urgent action, says the report, the impacts of climate change will soon cascade into every corner of American life. James Cook, BBC News, Los Angeles.
To sport now, and at the BBC Sports Centre, it's Mike Bushell. Good afternoon, Mike.
Good afternoon, Sean. Thank you. Well, England's cricketers may have already won their Test series in Sri Lanka, but it seems they're now on course for a 3-0 series win after a brilliant spell today from the bowlers and fielders. After England had been dismissed for 336, Keaton Jennings showed incredible reactions to take an early catch to dent the Sri Lankan openers. The hosts, though, seemed to be building a strong first innings lead before then a dramatic collapse. In just under 15 overs after tea, 8 wickets fell for 57 runs, Jennings taking 4 catches at short leg. And Adil Rashid finished with Test best figures of 5 for 49 as Sri Lanka were bowled out for 240. England were 3 without loss and led by 99 when bad light ended play. Meanwhile, England's women will face Australia tonight in the World T20 final in Antigua. They'll be looking to add to the 50-over World Cup title they won last year and so become double world champions again. Joe Curry is there for us.
The Sir Viv Richards Stadium is one of the most iconic grounds in the world, and cricket fans will be hoping that this final does it justice. But why wouldn't it? The rivalry between England and Australia is as old as cricket itself. But this final doesn't just give England the opportunity to get one over on a familiar foe, it also gives them the opportunity to make history. And that's because it's been almost a decade now since they were last crowned double world champions. And now they find themselves just one game away from adding the World T20 to the one-day title they claimed last year. For Captain Heather Knight, she says it's a huge opportunity.
It's a probably once-in-a-career opportunity that comes along, and if we do manage to do it, it's going to be a real achievement. So, yeah, we've put ourselves in the best possible place to go out and do that, and now it's all about how we perform tomorrow. It would put the sort of team of 2017, 2018 in the books, in the history books, the same way 2009 was. So, yeah, that's what you want as a player. You want to be remembered for winning trophies and being successful, and that's no different for this team now.
So England on the verge of being crowned double world champions for the first time since 2009. But if it's Australia who claim this final, well, they'll also make history. It'll be their 4th title, more than any other team. And if you at home want to follow all the action you can do, you can listen to full match commentary on Test Match Special on 5 Live and 5 Live Sports Extra. Yes, it gets underway at midnight, but tune in, set your alarms. It's going to be an absolutely cracking final.
Joe Curry there. Now it's the final day of Rugby Union's Autumn Internationals. Wales take on South Africa, aiming to win their first ever clean sweep of autumn victories. Wales have won 4 of the past 5 meetings between the two sides and are currently on an 8-match winning run after victories over Scotland and Australia, and Tonga as well earlier this month. Elsewhere, England aim to finish their autumn on a high. They host Australia at Twickenham. Scotland take on Argentina at Murrayfield. And Ireland, fresh off the back of beating New Zealand last week, face slightly less challenging opposition in the form of the USA. In football, the Premier League returns this afternoon after the international break. The game of the day is at tea time, with Chelsea taking on Spurs at Wembley. Claudio Ranieri, meanwhile, is back in the Premier League now, managing bottom side Fulham, who take on Southampton. Liverpool travel to Watford, and Manchester City, they face West Ham. And after a slow start, the champions in Scotland, Celtic, are enjoying a 6-game unbeaten run in the Premiership. They're in action as well in the early kick-off away at Hamilton and have taken an early lead. Ryan Christie opening the scoring for the league leaders there. Plenty more to come this afternoon, but that's all the sport for now. Back to you, Sean.
Thank you very much. Mike Bushell there at the BBC Sports Centre. The next news on BBC One is at 5:10. Have a good afternoon. Hello, you're watching the BBC News Channel with me, Sean Lay. It's now 12 minutes past 1. Theresa May is heading for Brussels for... Oh, I'm sorry, I think we have the wrong introduction there, agency. Let's move on. The National Crime Agency has issued a warning ahead of about organised gangs, which it says are behind a recent spike in illegal attempts to cross the English Channel in small boats and dinghies. The NCA says that crossing the channel in this way is highly dangerous and demonstrates a lack of regard for human life. This morning, the authorities picked up 5 migrants from a small boat just off the coast southwest of Calais. On Friday, 8 Iranians were brought ashore after their dinghy was spotted off the coast of Kent. In fact, just this month alone, there have been more than 100 suspected migrants picked up by the authorities after reaching UK waters. Well, anyway, I spoke to Chris Hogben. He's the National Crime Agency's operational lead for tackling people smuggling, and asked him why the numbers attempting the crossing are increasing.
We've seen a real spike in the numbers of attempts across the channel by small boats and ribs involving almost exclusively Iranian migrants since the beginning of October. We're now working with our UK law enforcement colleagues and also with the French law enforcement to try to identify the crime groups behind it and, of course, to bring them to justice, ultimately stopping the attempts. I would just say, though, that this is nothing new. We have seen attempts using small boats and ribs on and off over the last 2 or 3 years. What's really changed is the intensity in terms of the numbers. You know, we have seen a real spike in this since the beginning of October.
Is that spike likely to reduce again because of the weather conditions, if nothing else changes at least?
Yeah, this week we've generally seen fairly calm weather, which obviously makes it easier, I guess, for people to try these attempts. What I would say is this is a really dangerous method of trying to enter the UK. One of the downsides, to a certain extent, some might say, with the tightened security around the UK border is the fact that it makes the criminals and the migrants far more desperate, if you like, in terms of the measures that they will go to try to beat that security. And one of the things that we see is the increase in this type of activity. Now, we're talking about people using small boats and ribs to cross the English Channel, one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world, invariably at night, invariably with a helmsman who's got very little, if any, experience. And of course, we're also talking about a small boat or rib that we'd probably class as overloaded. And on almost every occasion, the migrants themselves don't have any form of safety equipment. So we're talking about a very dangerous method. And when you look upstream at the Mediterranean region, so the Central Med, the Eastern Med and the Western Med routes, you know, we've seen a number of tragedies over the last 3 years where people have lost their lives there. And it's probably very, very fortunate indeed that we haven't seen that sort of thing back in the English Channel.
A leading British surgeon has told the BBC about his experiences training medics in Gaza during times of conflict. According to the UN, more than 5,000 people have suffered bullet wounds in the war-torn region this year alone. Many doctors have been aided by John Wolfe, a retired surgeon from St Mary's Hospital in West London. Our Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman went to meet him.
This is a conflict that has changed even more lives this year. Thousands of Palestinians in Gaza have suffered bullet wounds during protests at the perimeter fence with Israel. It has put intense pressure on Gaza's hospitals.
You just open your fingers, let go, catch.
In this makeshift classroom, Palestinian surgeons learn the painstaking work of repairing arteries and avoiding amputation. They practice on goats' arteries and learn from a British arterial surgeon, a world leader in his field. Palestinians have protested since March, demanding a right to return to ancestral homelands from the blockaded Strip. Israel defends the use of live ammunition, pointing to violent attacks against its troops, stirred up, it says, by Gaza's militant leaders.
This is another person being brought in as the protests at the fence continue. The problem is that each of these cases, as the numbers build up, require specialist surgical skills in a healthcare system already under pressure and which lacks doctors.
This volume of severe injuries is something that most countries never see. There are a lot of bullet wounds, as you know. There have been now over 5,000 bullet wounds since the end of March. And I was asked to come 3 years ago to try and improve the standards of arterial surgery in Gaza and train up people in arterial surgery here. There aren't enough, certainly when there's conflict, there aren't enough arterial surgeons.
No, don't touch, just leave, just let him work.
John Wolfe came to Gaza with the International Red Cross. In surgery with Palestinian medics, he passes on more than 40 years of experience.
That's good, that's good. Now you're in business.
Learning from him is Ahmed Abu Hada, who now leads a small team of arterial surgeons at this hospital. They have performed complex operations on more than 140 bullet wounds since March.
Post-gunshot injury in the left leg.
It took 4 hours of surgery to save Ola Hossein's leg.
I felt like I was dying, but they brought me back to life. I am truly grateful to the doctors.
Every Friday, more young people come back from the fence with severe injuries. The training from a British surgeon has helped save limbs. But in Gaza's crowded wards, the risk of infection, which can mean amputation, still looms. More lives changed as this conflict continues. Tom Bateman, BBC News, Gaza.
As we were saying earlier, the White House has dismissed a hard-hitting report on climate change, which was compiled by parts of the government because of its warning of the impact on the US economy and society. More than a dozen US agencies were involved in the work, and the report says the size of the US economy would shrink by 10% by the end of this century if no action were to be taken. Well, let's talk now to Dr. Mikhail Nakhmani, a policy analyst with the Grantham Institute for Climate Change. She's with you in the studio. Welcome. Dr. Nakhmani, first of all, what do you make of this report?
Well, this report alarms us that everything that we already know about climate change is indeed happening even to the biggest economy in the world. And if that biggest economy does not take active measures, both to mitigate the effect of climate change and also to deal with the disasters that are already coming, then severe effects would be brought upon American families and businesses.
The term of a US president is comparatively short, 4 years, short of a lot of presidential terms elsewhere. But it's possible, of course, he could stand for a second term, and Donald Trump is pretty clear that he doesn't believe in man-made climate change. In the absence of that political push from the top, what can be done at other levels of government in the US to start to reduce this potential impact?
Well, luckily, President Trump's approach has not seeped down to national and to local governments in the U.S., and that's a very encouraging thing. We see action on all levels in the U.S. We see New York City both deciding earlier this year to divest its pension fund investment from fossil fuels altogether, and at the same time to take the fossil fuel industry to court over damages incurred by Hurricane Sandy. We see local communities everywhere taking action to be prepared, acknowledge climate change and prepare themselves for damages. And of course we can see the enormous action that can be taken by citizens around the world and in the States, of course, in their daily lives and behaviors.
And in terms of legal action, has anywhere where this approach has been attempted, actually, in a sense, hitting them where it hurts, in the wallet, where it's been successful?
Where there's increasing litigation action on many levels. So as I mentioned, more and more entities are taking the fossil fuel industry to courts, but also citizens are taking their governments to court to hold them accountable. The Dutch Supreme Court just ruled a few weeks ago that the Dutch government was indeed not doing enough as a result of a petition filed by concerned citizens.
So they won that case?
They have won that case, and they've won the appeal in the Supreme Court as well.
So it'll be interesting to see what effect it has on policy. For those who aren't in perhaps a position where they feel they can be involved in a court action of that kind, or maybe there isn't the opportunity for a court action, what sort of behaviour change can be made at the micro level? Because you know what people often say, well, yeah, I'd love to make a difference, I'd love to help, but it's not going to be enough for me to do something.
Well, there's so many things that one can do in daily lives, from making sure that you are with the right energy provider that produces energy by renewable sources or by lower carbon sources. There are dietary choices you can make. There are consumption choices you can make. We're a day after Black Friday, in which people buy ridiculous amounts of useless things which they really do not need and that cause damage to the planet. And of course, citizens in democratic societies have to engage with their politicians on all levels, in the local levels and in the national levels, to make sure that the people that those politicians are making the right decisions.
Looking at commercial decisions as part of this, and indeed decisions that governments make when they're operating in a kind of a commercial environment, trying to generate income for their country. China is exporting some of its fossil fuel power station knowledge and skill to countries like Serbia and other parts of the world. In a sense, it's all very well for the Chinese to be paying lip service to some of the good things people want to achieve in climate change, but if they're doing things like that elsewhere in the world, doesn't that cancel out any benefit that might be found at home?
I think all economies are moving in different paces and in different ways towards a lower carbon and eventually a no carbon economy. And China are doing many things as a huge economy. They have been very ambitious in their climate change policies, but those transitions cannot be very, very quick. Sometimes you have to take time in order to meet your growth needs. And I think there is a movement in the right direction, albeit not in the right pace, by all actors, and China included.
And finally, just on the question of this US report, do you hold out any hope of it changing minds in the White House?
It's a good question. I think maybe President Trump should take his report and have a nice weekend reading and see what 13 federal agencies have said to him. And again, bringing it back to the fact that especially when dealing with the results of climate change and with the disasters that are associated with it, a lot of local action is important, and that local action is indeed happening.
Dr. Mikhail Nakmani from the Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change in London. Thank you very much. Now, researchers in Florida have shown that bottlenose dolphins can work together to perform and complete tasks. The Dolphin Research Centre undertook a year-long project in collaboration with the University of Western Australia and studied pairs of dolphins in the Florida Keys. Gail McClellan tells us what they found.
Dolphins have long been regarded as the most intelligent of marine mammals. And this study confirms their extraordinary abilities. Researchers wanted to see if dolphins could actively cooperate with each other, not just perform the same action in the same place and time. Could they understand their partner's role in the game?
The game was the dolphins have to swim across the lagoon and press the buttons simultaneously, specifically within a 1-second time window.
To succeed, the two dolphins each had to press their button at the same time, whether they'd been sent across the lagoon together or with a delay in time of up to 20 seconds. The buttons were wired to a computer to record the actions and time difference.
The dolphins didn't just succeed at this task, they were amazing at it. So by the end, the difference in time between their button presses was just 370 milliseconds. That's about 1/3 of a second. And that kind of precision shows that they didn't just cooperate, but then they actively coordinated in a super precise way to synchronize their behaviors.
When one dolphin was delayed, the other would wait so they could press the buttons together, or the delayed dolphin would swim significantly faster than its partner to make up the difference, showing a sophisticated understanding of how to play the game. While it's not unusual for mammals to work cooperatively in the wild, these dolphins have shown that some understand how a partner's role combines with their own. Researchers believe that this is an intellectual ability that dolphins apply to many different situations in the wild. Gail McClellan, BBC News.
The Duke and Duchess of Sussex will be moving out of Kensington Palace and into their own cottage before the birth of their first child. Harry and Meghan will move to Frogmore Cottage in the grounds of Windsor Castle early next year. The couple got married at Windsor in May and held their reception for around 200 guests at Frogmore House, which is a 17th century royal residence on the same estate. Kensington Palace said Windsor was a very special place for the couple. Now, do you recognise this sound? Yes, it's pretty recognisable, isn't it? The millions of people who've been to see it. The Lion King. But this is not as you or I know it. The trailer for the live-action retelling. Hello again, this is BBC News with me, Sean Lay. The headlines this hour. Theresa May is set to head to Brussels for talks this afternoon with top EU officials ahead of tomorrow's crucial summit, which will formally sign off the Brexit deal. However, Spain has said it will not attend unless a last-minute disagreement over Gibraltar is resolved. The UP Deputy Leader Nigel Dodds has told the PM it's not too late to bin her Brexit deal. Speaking at his party's annual conference in Belfast, he warned that the proposed withdrawal agreement would see the UK assume a pitiful and pathetic place. French police have fired tear gas and water cannon to try to disperse protesters in Paris, demonstrating for a second weekend against rising fuel prices. And as we've just been hearing, the White House has dismissed a government report that warns unchecked climate change will seriously damage the economy and affect human health. The warning is at odds with the Trump administration's position and pro-fossil fuels agenda. Thank you very much for your company so far today. Luquesa will be here at the top of the hour. Now, though, on BBC News, Kirsty Walk speaks to the acclaimed Chilean author Isabel Allende about the power of storytelling, her previous life as a refugee, and desire to live a passionate life.
Isabel Allende is one of the most acclaimed writers in the world. Her novels have sold more than 70 million copies and have been translated from Spanish into 42 languages. She draws on her own eventful life in her fiction, stories of love, exile and loss. She truly is the queen of Spanish literature. An activist and a feminist, I've come to Sausalito in California, where she lives, for this special 100 Women interview. We talk about the power of storytelling, her work among impoverished women and children, and her desire to live a passionate life. Isabel Allende, what was it about your childhood and the upbringing in Chile that kind of prepared you in a way for being such a storyteller?
You know, I was born in the 40s in Chile. There was no television. I lived in my grandfather's house, who was a widower and in mourning for many years. So there was no radio, no theater, no entertainment of any sort except reading and telling stories. So I think that prepared me for this vice of storytelling. Not only telling them, I love to hear stories. And I have had that inclination all my life.
You had these two incredible characters. You had your mother and your grandfather. But it was also a tumultuous time personally for you. And I think one of the most extraordinary things was hearing that your mum, when your father left, cut his picture out all the photographs. I mean, that as an image for a child growing up must have been extraordinary.
Well, I never missed my father. Maybe I did when I was very young, but I don't remember that. Because he left when I was 3. And my mother says that I was very close to him. So maybe there was a moment when I asked about him, but I don't remember that at all. I remember a childhood without a father, and this big absence didn't mean anything to me much. There were no photographs of him. His name was never mentioned. And if anybody, my brothers or I, would ask, my mother would say he was a very intelligent man. Nothing else. That was it.
And you never asked further? You knew not to ask further?
Yeah, because it would upset her.
In My Invented Country, your memoir, you write, Chile is a hypocritical country bustling with scruples in relation to sex and sensuality, a nation of old ladies, male and female. For someone as passionate as you, did it feel stultifying?
Absolutely. It was. Remember the time also. Then I went through the 50s in Chile. It was, here it was stifling, in Chile it was terrible. Plus, I belong to a very socially conservative family and Catholic. So there was that also in my background. In a household that was my grandfather's house, but with my uncles, bachelor uncles, my mother was the only female, and I could see, very early on, I could see what a disadvantage it is to be born a woman. And I say it is because it still is. In spite of everything that women have achieved in my lifetime, I feel that men have a better deal.
But then you worked in this new magazine, Paula.
Oh, that was much later.
But which hit Chile like a hurricane.
It did.
So you were writing about things that were taboo. You were talking about women's sexuality. What was it that was so extraordinary for Chileans to read?
Because people didn't talk about a lot of things. And of course nothing was published about that. And then this magazine came out, which was first of all very beautiful. It had fashion and beauty, and it was all color, and it was just lovely. And very avant-garde for Chile at the time. There was no competition. And we were 4 women or 3 journalists that were young, and we had read feminist books from England and from the United States. We were full of ideas, and we didn't care about anything. We just were very defiant and rebellious, and it was fun. So we started publishing articles and interviews about things that nobody had ever talked publicly in Chile, like abortion and infidelity and adultery and prostitution and drugs and stuff that were totally taboo. My grandfather was absolutely horrified. He couldn't believe that someone from his own blood was writing this kind of thing.
But then you have the coup. So your father's cousin is Salvador Allende, and you must remember that time. You know, you were a young woman. It was an extraordinary time. And then the coup. Can you remember exactly where you were during the coup?
Yeah, I was in my house. The coup was happening downtown Santiago. And then I left with my car, and I realized that something was going on. The streets were empty, and there were trucks, military trucks, and something was happening. And I got to my office, and it was closed. And the concierge that was at the door said, "Go back home, go back home. This is a military coup." He was very happy because he was a total right-wing jerk. And, and he said, "Go home." I didn't know what a military coup was, because in Chile we didn't have precedent for this.
But if that was terrifying then, it became much more terrifying.
You know, the first day was terrifying because it was so unexpected. The helicopters, the bombing of the palace, the shooting, the burning of books, the arresting people and shovel them into the trucks. All that was terrifying the first day, but then we had a curfew, and nobody could get out for 3 days. And television everything was censored. You didn't have any news, only rumors. So in a way, in those 3 days, we sort of got used to the idea that something extraordinary had happened, but it wouldn't last. The idea that it was just like an historical accident. And then in the months to come, in the days, weeks, and months to come, we realized what it is to live in terror. For half the population, because the other half was having a great time.
And indeed, that split initially was also in your own family.
Everywhere. Everywhere, not only my family. I think that every family in Chile had at least one person that had suffered the repression. And families were split. Couples were split.
Eventually, you fell foul of the regime. How was that?
I started hiding people and trying to get people into embassies for asylum, which many people were doing. There was nothing heroic about this because we really didn't know the consequences yet. And then later, when the circle of repression closed more and became more efficient, then I got scared.
And got denounced?
Well, yeah, but people were denouncing everywhere.
In your latest novel, In the Midst of Winter, you return to Chile in 1973, and your protagonist, Lucia, gets out of Chile with the help of a family friend, a cardinal. How did you get out?
I got out with no problem. I had a passport. I just went to the airport and left, alone first. And I went to Venezuela, because Venezuela was one of the very few democratic countries left in Latin America where you could go, and they would give a visa to a Chilean, because in Mexico we were not allowed anymore. And so I just left, thinking I'll come back in a month.
Yeah.
And then my husband said, well, he found out that I couldn't go back, and so then he left with the children. We closed the house and he left.
You've said, you've written that there's quite a different thing being in exile and being an immigrant. I mean,
of course.
Exile, of course, was not chosen, but you were in Caracas for, what, 13 years?
I was in Caracas for 13 years, and I ended up loving that country, Venezuela, and loving its people. And I left because I fell in love with an American, and I moved here before we had democracy in Chile.
Is that a regret that you didn't return?
I don't regret anything, because the important events in my life have happened in spite of me. They have not been under my control. The fact that my father left, that I lived with my grandfather, that I've been a foreigner, that I was a political refugee, that eventually I became an immigrant. All these things happened like decided by destiny or karma or who knows what. And I have just lived whatever life offered me.
In exile in Caracas, you came upon the idea of being a writer. You already were a journalist, but you came upon the idea of being a writer. I mean, holding on to memories, you said, it helped to break the chain of hate in your soul. What did you mean by that?
Because there was, and I think this happened to many people, that when you are forced out of a place, when you have to leave everything behind, when you feel that everything that was dear and familiar to you is lost, you have grudges, and you feel that something is owed to you, or something, that you have been stolen of something. I got over that feeling completely.
Because the irony that the coup in Chile by Pinochet was backed by the US, and yet the US has been your home for all this time.
Yes, and there are many things about the US that I don't like. Mostly the intervention in Latin America, not only in Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, but what's happening today in Central America is the consequences of the Americans who were there backing murderous dictatorships.
I mean, the CIA's involvement in South America has been well charted. You know, we'll go on and talk about Donald Trump later, but just to carry on that idea that there's this caravan of Hondurans and Guatemalans. What should Donald Trump do about them? What should be done about them?
Well, I think that you have to help. That it's not, you cannot send troops to stop families with children and babies. That's crazy. The way, and I have a friend who has studied this in depth, the way to stop refugees is improve the conditions in their places of origin. There were no Syrian refugees in the world before the war started in Syria, and now there are 5 million displaced people. In Central America, especially Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, what is called now the Triangle of the North, which is taken over by narcos, by gangs, by corrupt police. Nothing works, and people are living in poverty and in terror. People leave. Now,